Today we're unpacking a really wild piece of source material called Iran and Mahdi, the hidden connection. And I mean, it starts with a bang, literally. It lays out this startling hypothetical scenario of a massive United States attack on Iran on February 28th, 2026. But according to the narrator of this material, we're not just looking at future geopolitics. No, they claim this conflict was actually decided 200 years ago, and it's tied up in secret societies, numerology, and ancient prophecies. Now, our goal today isn't to endorse any of this, but we're going to map out exactly how the source builds this incredible narrative. Okay, let's dive into this. So, here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the historical roots, then move into the Islamic Revolution, followed by modern geopolitical tensions. From there, things take a turn into secret societies and numerology. And finally, we'll wrap up with the apocalyptic war narrative. Let's get started. Section 1, the historical roots. We're looking at U.S.-Iran relations from the 1940s to the 1970s. You know, to really grasp the narrator's prediction of a future apocalypse, we have to look at the historical foundation they're building on. The original material traces a very specific timeline here. It basically frames Shah Reza Pahlavi as a puppet installed by the West. Then, in 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh becomes prime minister and reclaims Iranian oil from British control. But just 2 years later, in 1953, the CIA and MI6 step in with Operation Ajax, removing Mossadegh and putting the Shah back in power. According to the source, this intervention lit the match. It sparked the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini, who started heavily criticizing this Western-backed rule throughout the 1960s. And this perfectly illustrates the massive ideological divide at the heart of the source's historical argument. On one side, you've got the Shah's westernized Iran, think secular reforms and strong U.S. backing, which the narrator views as a total abandonment of Islamic law. On the flip side, you have Khomeini's Islamic vision, which pushes for strict rule by Islamic scholars. The original material makes the case that this clash was never just political, it was a fundamental, uncompromising battle for the absolute soul of the nation. Section 2, the Islamic Revolution, power shifts and the 1980s. So that ideological battle we just talked about, it reached an absolute boiling point in 1979. When you think about the geopolitical headlines you read today, this is really the historical fulcrum that defines them. The events of '79 completely severed U.S.-Iran ties. The Shah fled, Khomeini returned to these massive, roaring crowds, and Iran officially became an Islamic republic. You probably know the U.S. was famously labeled the Great Satan. The source points to the U.S. embassy hostage crisis and the billions in frozen Iranian assets that followed as the critical moment this modern enmity was set in stone. The West lost its foothold, and regional tension just skyrocketed. That tension immediately bled right into the Iran-Iraq War. And what's interesting is how the source frames this grueling 8-year conflict. They don't just see it as a border dispute, but as a highly coordinated, Western-backed attempt to destroy the brand-new Islamic Republic. The narrator heavily emphasizes Iran's total isolation against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They claim Iraq was massively funded by the U.S. and Arab nations and was even using illegal chemical weapons. But despite this huge asymmetry in international support, the source points out that Iran maintained its territory. Section 3, modern geopolitical tensions. We're looking at the Middle East today. Let's see how all this historical bad blood translates into the modern geopolitical landscape. The original material argues that these decades of conflict have created a very specific, incredibly high-stakes standoff today. And the crucial point here is leverage. The source points straight to the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway controls 20% of the world's oil supply, and the source frames it as Iran's ultimate trump card. The narrator's argument is that Iran's ability to essentially shut down this strait and send global oil prices through the roof is exactly why Western powers are so hyper-fixated on controlling the region. From there, the narrator maps out the Middle East in these starkly binary terms. They claim that a huge majority of the region, an estimated 70%, representing countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and newly installed regimes in Libya and Syria, are practically under U.S. and Israeli control. Iran, standing alongside Palestine, makes up the remaining 30%. The source portrays them as the lone, powerful resistors standing in the way of total Western hegemony over the region. And that brings us to the source's domino theory. The narrator aggressively pushes the claim that if Iran falls, a massive chain reaction begins. Step 2, Turkey is targeted and conquered. Step 3, Pakistan, which actually possesses nuclear weapons, is targeted and neutralized. The source even brings up recent diplomatic visits between regional leaders to claim that this exact sequence is already in motion behind closed doors. Up to this point, the source has relied heavily on a mix of history and aggressive geopolitical theory. But right here is where the explainer takes a massive pivot. The narrator asks a really compelling question. Is this just about oil and borders, or are there deeper, hidden forces at play? Section 4, Secret Societies and Numerology. The Hidden Hand. Okay, so here is where the original material completely departs from standard political analysis and plunges deep into the realm of secret societies, hidden codes, and numerology. And remember, we are strictly breaking down the narrator's claims here. The source introduces a guy named Albert Pike. The narrator describes him as a 19th century Freemason and, wait for it, a Satan worshiper. This entire conspiracy hinges on a letter allegedly written by Pike back in 1871. The author claims this letter flawlessly predicted the outcomes of both World War I and World War II, literally decades before they ever happened. But it's Pike's supposed prediction for a third world war that the source really zeroes in on. The narrator quotes this letter, claiming World War III is going to be orchestrated between Zionism and Islam, resulting in mutual destruction that clears the way for a religion of Satan. The narrator argues that this 150-year-old script is exactly what is playing out in the Middle East right this second. To prove this hidden orchestration, the source turns to numerology, specifically the number 33. The narrator links this number, which is highly significant in Freemasonry, to a specific blood moon eclipse happening on March 3rd at 3. They even tie it to Donald Trump's birth date, suggesting that these events aren't mere coincidence, but are actually mathematically coded by secret societies. And then there's the number 47. The original material places heavy emphasis on the fact that Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States, and that it's been exactly 47 years since the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The narrator claims that in Freemasonry, 47 refers to the New World Order. They use this to argue that current global leaders are witting agents of this grand hidden design. Building on this idea that the universe speaks in mathematical codes, the source presents a pretty chilling parallel. They point out that the calendar year for 2026 is an exact day and date match to 1914, the exact year World War I began. The narrator uses this to bolster their opening claim that 2026 is the pre-planned date for a massive global conflict originating in Iran. Section 5, the Apocalyptic War Narrative. Eschatology and the End Times. Now, what's really interesting about this section is how the narrator bridges the gap from conspiracy straight into theology. They completely merge their geopolitical predictions with ancient religious end times prophecies. And the apocalyptic claims here are extreme. The source asserts that the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque are being deliberately undermined by tunnels so it can be collapsed and blamed on Iran. They frame the entire Middle Eastern conflict not as political, but as a fully orchestrated religious war. They even go as far as claiming that certain Christian groups actively support building a third temple to trigger the return of Jesus, purposefully trying to rush humanity toward the prophesied battle of Armageddon. The source frequently brings up the term Dajjal, which is the false messiah or antichrist in Islamic eschatology. In a really startling claim, the narrator suggests that current Western military leaders, and they specifically call out the U.S. Secretary of Defense here, are literal, active supporters of the Dajjal. They even claim physical markings prove their allegiance to demonic forces. The source also introduces Ghazwa-e-Hind, which is a prophesied end-times battle in the Indian subcontinent. The narrator actually uses this ancient prophecy to explain modern civil unrest and regional tensions today. They claim that an alleged alliance between India and Israel is a direct fulfillment of this religious text, aimed squarely at destabilizing Pakistan. Finally, the original material summarizes its entire worldview with this incredibly vivid metaphor. They say, Iran is the thread of the rosary. If it breaks, the whole rosary will scatter. It's the narrator's ultimate argument. They believe Iran is the final, essential bulwark protecting the Islamic world from total collapse and the onset of a dark, prophesied new world order. And that brings us to the end of this highly charged source material. It takes real historical events like the 1953 coup and just weaves them right together with Freemasonry, mathematical codes, and end times theology to present this terrifying vision of 2026. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When historical facts are blended so seamlessly with apocalyptic prophecy, how do we actually separate the geopolitical reality from the religious narrative? Thanks for exploring this with me, and definitely keep questioning what you consume.